In this edition of the interview, I am joined by Dr. Sanjaya Baru, Secretary General of Ficci. Sir, thank you for making time for Wion. And let me begin this interview by asking you, what explains the Moody's new ratings?
Well, I think Moody's new rating is actually quite delayed. India deserved a rating upgrade quite some time back. If you see the economic survey published by the Ministry of Finance, Dr. Arvind Subramaniam had a very good analysis of rating agencies. And he asked a very important question, which is that China's overall macroeconomic numbers are not in fact as impressive as India's. And how come China has investment grade while India doesn't? So in a sense, Moody's are catching up. They are the ones who are catching up rather than that we have done something special for them to now recognize India's need to be upgraded. I think the other rating agencies are yet to catch up.
So, these ratings have come in the wake of GST and demonetization. Many experts are saying that the economy has shrunk. And in that financial context, the new rating says that, from the perspective of long-term economy, we'll be doing very well. Can you please shed light on that dynamics?
I think Moody's have used GST or some of the other policy changes, including the improvement in India's rank in ease of doing business, as a peg, as an opportunity to catch up. As I said, I think India deserved investment grade much earlier. We were, after all, last couple of years, the world's fastest growing economy. FDI was coming into India in larger and larger numbers. So the Indian economy had a good story to tell. It took a couple of knocks from demonetization and GST. But overall, the India story was a strong story. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, they should have upgraded India long back. So they are now using these policy changes that the government has made as a way of justifying their own delayed action.
So are you saying these ratings will have an impact on the economy?
Well, ratings certainly have a positive impact in the sense they make it cheaper for Indian companies, Indian banks to borrow internationally. And to the extent that international rates are still below India's interest rates, the cost of finance for companies, for financial institutions will come down.
But then a lot of experts have also said that this does not mean that financial or the fiscal prudence to be undone, which means that it should not lead to announcement of slew of reforms which in UPA 2 Manmohan Singh did after S&P came out with some warnings.
Exactly. I mean, I think in UPA there was much more fiscal liberalism. Government spent a lot of money, particularly before the 2009 election and also after 2009 crisis, the global financial crisis. This government has, in my view, been very conservative. In fact, as Viki, we are a Chamber of Commerce, Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. We have taken the view that the roadmap for fiscal consolidation that was announced on the basis of the NK Singh Committee report was a very conservative roadmap, because this year the government was committed to reducing the fiscal deficit to 3.2% of GDP. And in fact, at Ficci, we have issued a statement saying even if it's 3.5%, heavens are not going to fall. We are a developing country. Government has to spend. Private investment has not been picking up. Overall growth has slowed down. So I don't see anything wrong in government spending a little more to boost demand.
But then high deficit levels also remain a cause of concern.
Well, I agree, we should not have high deficit levels, but going from 3.2% of GDP to 3.5% of GDP, in our judgment, is not such a big slippage. And therefore, India should not be punished for a little additional spending. The government wants to do rural electrification, they want to go invest in affordable housing, they want to invest in more roads, etc. They should be allowed to, because that will boost demand for cement, demand for steel, demand for various industrial materials, and that will have a positive effect.
Are you saying, as Ficci's Secretary General, which many other experts have also espoused, that you really need spendings to be upped in rural areas so that the demand goes up, like construction of rural housing, electrification in rural housing means that then somebody will say that, well, okay, we can buy a mixie, because if you don't have electricity, there is no point buying a mixie. Exactly. So are you saying that that approach will work much better?
That approach always works better. There's a very simple law in economics, which is that if you expect the future to be better, you take such decisions, whether it's respect to saving or investment or consumption, that actually end up improving the economic situation. On the other hand, if you feel the future is not going to be bright, you tend to cut back on consumption, you tend to cut back, increase your saving, you tend to spend less money. and as a result demand goes down, right? So if your future you think is positive, expectations about the future are positive, the economy benefits from that. And that is what drove the Indian economy from 2003 to 2012. For 9 years, we had above 8% growth because there was a certain optimism about the future. After the 2012, series of steps taken by the previous government and inadequate steps by this government in its first couple of years meant that the overall sentiment in the Indian economy became very, what economists call bearish, negative. And I think in the last 1 year, what Prime Minister Modi has done is to turn the tide around and make expectations positive.
So, I think the biggest reform or biggest structural change which this government has done is perhaps only GST, combining the market to ensure that the fragmented markets don't exist. But it went through multiple recalibration. So, the GST 2.0 version we have, do you think it satisfies the industry?
Well, not yet, because I think most people, and certainly Indian business wants fewer rates. We began with too many rates. But I think many of us understand that any major fiscal reform, any major change in the taxation system, governments tend to be extremely cautious, because the single most important objective of the Ministry of Finance is always to ensure that change does not result in a decline in revenues. So you want to ensure that your revenues do not decline as a result of policy change. And I think having these very high rates and having put too many commodities on the 28% GST was a deliberate decision to ensure that initially let us see what the impact of GST would be on revenue. The fact is that in the first month revenues sharply went down, but in the second and third month they have improved. So I think this improvement in revenues has given the government some confidence that even if we take many commodities out of 28 and bring them under lower rates of taxation, the overall revenue would not be that badly impacted. And it's entirely understandable that any government, anywhere in the world, would not undertake reform that would reduce its ability to spend, its ability to invest. So tax reform has to be revenue neutral in order for it to be really successful. And I think the issue with GST was nobody knew what would be the impact of GST. So as we are seeing the experience on the ground, the government is recalibrating, and which is good. And I think it's good that the government actually admits that there is need for change. That is an important recognition, where the finance minister, the prime minister, they've all said that yes, what we did in July is not the last word, it's not the correct thing to have done, but we did it for certain reasons. And now as we get feedback from the ground, we are recalibrating.
So, can it be said that, or can GST be equated to the reforms unleashed by Narasimha Rao and then Dr. Manmohan Singh as the finance minister? Does GST comes in the same category?
In a manner, yes, in the sense that in the field of taxation, it's a fundamental change. We have moved away from the old regime to a completely new regime. In 1991, the government did two very different things. One was delicensing, decontrol, getting rid of what was called the license permit trust. That was in fact the most important policy intervention. And the second important policy intervention was trade policy reform, when India reduced its tariffs from over 300% peak rates to more meaningful rates. So the trade policy reform and the industrial policy reform were major policy reforms, right? The third thing which the government did, and this was done by the Ministry of Finance under Dr. Manmohan Singh, was to sharply bring down the fiscal deficit, right? Fiscal stabilization. That had a negative impact initially on the economy. People forget that the economy's growth rate in 1988 or 89 was about 6%, in 89-90 it was about 5%. In 1991, the first year of fiscal consolidation, India's growth rate was 0.8%. So when you did a sharp reduction in fiscal deficit in 91, the economy actually collapsed. But that was for 1 year. It was like giving a booster shot to a patient, when you take an injection and then you have to sit down for a little while before you get over the initial pain, and then the recovery began. So the Indian economy benefited from this. In some ways, the GST impact is also similar. Initially the impact is negative, but over a period of time, I think the impact will be positive.
So, is it okay to say that, GST reforms, saying that, good economics make for bad politics in India?
In some ways, yes. I mean, after all, even in the early 90s, many people within the Congress party, forget about the opposition, even within the Congress party, blame Narasimha Rao for the Congress's defeat in a lot of assembly elections after 91 because of what was seen as the reforms. And today, I think there's a lot of criticism of the Prime Minister on GST that it's hurting their election prospects in Gujarat, etc. So, yes, I mean, there is a problem that some of these reforms have an initial negative effect on employment, on growth, and the initial negative effect has an immediate impact on the politics of that year of the day. But over a period of time, things can recover, and the Congress party, for example, recovered after its initial setbacks in the early 90s and came back to power later on.
So are you saying that it happens because GST is not only about transformative economics, it's also about sort of a behavioral change, a compliance. The state makes itself felt.
Absolutely. In fact, this is one point that successive governments have been talking about, successive prime ministers have been talking about, which is that the tax GDP ratio in India is low, tax compliance in India is low, many people do not pay tax. I mean, in a city like New Delhi, the capital of the country, there are large parts of the city where you have thriving businesses. People own these big Audis and BMWs. They don't pay tax. And, the real estate business, a lot of transactions are in the black where no tax is paid. So, I think forcing people to pay tax is not a popular thing to do. But no developing country can neglect it. You see, in the United States, when President Trump or the Republicans say we'll reduce tax, they are at a different level of development they can afford for the government to reduce its overall tax GDP ratio. In India, we cannot. The state is expected to do a lot more in infrastructure, in education, in health. There are many areas where we want the government to spend more. Where will the money come from?
That's unlike United States of America.
Yep.
Demonetization was an exercise which many people felt that created more political muscle for Bharatiya Janata Party than economic benefits for the country. In retrospect, do you think that it has really, demonetization has really worked against that so-called to bring back or unearth the black money?
I think, there were, in my judgment, three very different objectives to demonetization. First, there was this whole thing about reducing the cashless economy, increasing digital transactions, increasing credit card payments, etc. Second was to unearth black money. Third, in my judgment, was political. I think it changed the political discourse, particularly after the initial defeats that the ruling party had in Bihar and Delhi. I think it certainly changed the political discourse, and the political benefit was found in Uttar Pradesh, where the BJP did impressively very well. But on the first two economic objectives, I think the jury is out on the black economy. I mean, how much of it has been impacted. I think government is right to say that a lot of these transactions have now been unearthed, that investigations are going on. Even in this morning's newspapers, we read about, income tax raids and government pursuing tax evaders. So they have now the information to chase people who are not paying taxes. So in that sense, I think it has some impact on the black economy. I'm not sure if it has completely got rid of corruption. We still hear about corruption in various segments of the government, including the revenue system of this government. But on digital transactions, the data is positive. If you look at last 1 year, there's been a sharp increase in the use of credit cards, in the use of electronic payment, net banking, Beam card, various, cashless forms of economic transaction. The data is there and the data is positive. So to that extent, I think it has had a positive impact.
Do you feel that some of the Modi's politics in context of economic reforms and political posturing somehow, if not the word equivalent, reminds people of the way Indira Gandhi did her politics and economics?
In some ways, yes. I mean, after all, I think Mrs. Gandhi's strategy was to position herself as a messiah of the poor and someone who took away the privileges of the rich. She abolished privy purses of all these feudal kings and Maharajas, etc. She nationalized banks, taking them away from a lot of business, private business people. So she did a lot of things that hurt private wealth, that hurt privileged people. And she projected herself as a messiah of the poor. And in many ways, that's very similar to what Prime Minister Modi has been trying to do, which is to project himself as a messiah of the poor, doing things for the poor and hurting the rich. You know, Vijay Mallya has run away from the country. There are notices for his arrest. There are a lot of other businessmen whose assets are being seized. The banks are now demanding that their loans be recovered. So there is a pressure on the business community.
You know, this is the question which I really wanted to ask you a little later, but since you have come to this issue of banks, you know, Vijay Mallya is the poster boy of India's bad debt. Do you think that the government has in the past 3.5 years successful in plugging those loopholes, which they claimed existed during UPA 2?
Not entirely. I think the honest answer would be not entirely. But the bankruptcy bill and the the decision to support the banking system, the pressure on NPAs, all these are good things. I think they do ensure greater compliance. They do impose greater discipline on the functioning of the corporate sector. And frankly, at Ficci, we are in support of improved corporate governance. I think all our members would like to see an India in which businesses are operating transparently in a financially transparent manner, in which nobody is cheating the government of the day, etc. So those initiatives are very important and welcome. But I think what the political leadership should be a bit careful about is not to paint every businessman as corrupt or doing illegal things or being outside the scope of law. I mean, this is like what many of us in the media used to do. Every politician is corrupt, right? And then the political class said every journalist is corrupt. I mean, this kind of blanket categorization of professions to say that, oh, the entire profession is corrupt is wrong. Every doctor is not a money maker, right? Every doctor is not treating patients in a way to enrich himself. There are doctors who do that. So in every profession there are black sheep. But majority in every profession like to lead a honest life and make honest money and would like to adhere to the law of the land. That includes businesses too. So the only worry we at Ficci have is that this campaign against black money, campaign against people who are holding on to bank money and not repaying them, should not become a generalized campaign against business as a whole and discourage investment. Many Indian companies, in fact, have been leaving India, not just in the last couple of years, in the last 10 years. You see how many Indian companies are investing outside. They say it's easier for me to do business in Hungary or in South Africa than to do business in India. That should not happen. And I think that is where instilling greater confidence in Indian business is the first step to instill greater confidence in global business as a whole. We want foreign investment to come to India. Foreign investment will come to India when Indian investors remain invested in India.
You know, when we talk about economy and when we talk about Prime Minister Modi, Make in India and Made in India were two very important slogans he gave. But it hasn't taken off the way it was conceived then. Why?
I think, for a variety of reasons. First of all, as I said, there is no single India, so there are different states. The willingness of investors to put money in some Indian states is more than the willingness to put in other parts of the country. There are states where investment rates have been going up. But overall, I think the problem with the Make in India program, and this was initiative of even the UPA, I mean the original National Strategy on Manufacturing was drafted during Dr. Manmohan Singh's time, and the Make in India program is an extension of that. I think the problem was that not enough was done on the ease of doing business side in the first couple of years, which is what has now been the focus in the last 1 year, and we see the consequence of that. But we still have to go a long way in making it easier for people to do business in India. The second reason is that we were very hesitant in the beginning. For example, in defense, we said 49% is the limit for foreign investment, and very few foreign companies were willing to come at that. Then we had to say, no, no, case by case, we will go beyond 49, etc. So in some senses, we have opened the doors. People are still waiting on the other side and looking, thinking, and they have not yet entered in a big way. The effort now is to in fact draw in, now that the doors have been opened and we are reassuring everybody that these doors will not get shut, please come in. And if you want to go, you can leave whenever you like. So that reassurance given to foreign investors is always helpful.
This is going to be the last working budget. The next will be the vote on account. What are the expectations of industry to the budget which is going to be presented next year?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I think a little pause on the fiscal side. Don't have to go back to 3.2% of GDP, because the GDP itself has not grown as fast as we would have thought it would. So we hope the budget would have a positive impact on overall demand and would, for example, reduce. There is a commitment of the government to reduce the corporate tax. The finance minister has actually mentioned this a couple of times in the last 1 year, that policy objective remains on the table. So as far as my membership at Viki is concerned, they would like to see a reduction of the corporate tax. And persistent ease of doing business, policy initiatives that can make it easier.
The current corporate tax policy is problematic? No,
the rate is regarded as being too high, and that there is a feeling, and this is government view, in fact, that we should bring it down. So there's a commitment on the part of the government to bring it down, except there's no timeline. And so we are saying we hope it will be done now. But as you said, it's the last budget of the government, therefore politics would very much be on the mind of those who are drafting the budget. So I hope it strikes the right balance between political compulsions and economic compulsions.
Before I close in, there are two questions which I want to ask you. One is that if you look at European Union, they have also passed some similar laws whereby they are trying to curtail the Chinese imports. Do you think that our own market has been pretty too liberal in terms of getting deluged by all types of Chinese goods in India, which has become both an economic and a political issue?
This is a big issue. I mean, this huge trade deficit that stares us in the face, 2/3 of the total trade, is unacceptable. We have repeatedly raised this issue. Successive governments, both the UPA government and the current government, have raised this issue with the Chinese, that such a large trade deficit is unacceptable. And one of the reasons for the large trade deficit is that Indian exporters feel it very difficult to do business in China. I mean, there are many product lines where we can export to China on a competitive basis, but there are non-tariff barriers, there are all manner of disincentives. It's a non-transparent economy. And Indian companies have been finding it difficult to sell to China. So I think, I don't know if we should be introducing a law against Chinese imports, but we should certainly pay greater attention to this. There has been some talk about a public campaign against, buying made in China goods. Those will gain momentum if things don't get addressed.
In your opinion, you have seen the previous administration also. Why is there so much of delay in dealing with this unfairness?
Well, I think part of the reason is that we are also trying to engage China on the economic side to offset the differences we have on the political side, the border dispute, there are a lot of... But, so we have been a bit generous to China in the last several years, and that generosity is being tested. I mean, Doklam, for example, was a huge test. India has finally agreed to work with the United States, Japan and Australia in strengthening our security relationship with the Quad. These are all responses to the fact that the Chinese have not been attentive. We have been concerned about what they are doing in Pakistan. We have been concerned about their support for or unwillingness to address the terrorism issue, etc. So I think the Chinese have been testing us. We have been allowing them to test us through our generosity for some time, because after all, they are our neighbors. We want to have in the long run good relations. But beyond a point, India also gets tired, and I think at Doklam we took a tough line, and now with the Quad we are taking a tough line. We are telling the Chinese enough is enough. You guys don't address our concerns, then we'll have to rethink this relationship.
And last question, so you have recently become the Secretary General of Ficci. In what way you are providing a new direction to this organization?
You know, Ficci was started 90 years ago. This is the 90th year of Ficci. In 1927, Mahatma Gandhi called G.D. Birla, Ghanshyamdas Birla and J.R.D. Tata and told them that, you know, Indian business should also be part of the national movement and that they should come together as a business organization and support the national movement, which is how Ficci was born in 1927. And Ficci's mission over the years has been to be the voice of Indian business, to put forward such ideas and policies which strengthen the global competitiveness of Indian business. In some senses, I think that role got a bit diluted or overshadowed by a lot of other things that Ficci has been doing. There's been some criticism in general of all chambers that we do more events than invest in, you know, research, invest in creating new technologies. So I think the new direction we would certainly like to give in Ficci is to strengthen our knowledge capacity, our internal knowledge capacity, our ability to help Indian business. Only yesterday I signed a memorandum of understanding with the ICMR, Indian Council for Medical Research, to enable Indian companies to commercialize technologies, medical technologies, a lot of technology. We have now an agreement with the Indian Armed Forces. We do a knowledge sharing with the Indian Armed Forces, bringing researchers from IITs and engineering institutions and the armed forces together to look at what Indian industry can commercialize in terms of manufacturing. We are starting a new program on startups in defense, where we want to help Indian companies supply goods to the armed forces, to the defense manufacturing companies, etc. So, being a knowledge institution, not just a lobby for business, not just a event manager, but also a source of ideas, is what we would like to be. That is how Ficci began, and certainly that personality of Ficci will be strengthened.
So thank you. So thank you for making time for me.